Jonathan, and I have the profound honor of portraying Jesus in The Chosen. I just wanted to take a moment to thank you, not just for your support in watching the show, but for something just as vital to me personally, your prayers. Playing this role has been the most humbling experience of my life, and filming season 6 and the crucifixion, well, it's clear that that has been the most intense journey of my career. Every day on set, I'm reminded that we're not just making a television show, we're shepherding something sacred into the world, the most important story ever told. And knowing that people like you are lifting up this work in prayer, well, that means everything to me. So thank you for being part of the community that is lifting us all up as we portray the most important moments in human history. God bless you.
The moment I entered the hospital, everything felt strangely distant, as if I were walking into a place where time moved differently. The noises that usually filled such places, machines beeping, footsteps rushing, voices calling out, seemed muffled, like they were happening behind a thick wall. I remember sinking into the bed, feeling my strength draining faster than I could hold on to it. My body felt heavy, but my mind felt strangely alert, like something inside me knew this was not an ordinary moment. As the doctors moved around, speaking to one another in low tones, I could see their concern, even though they tried to mask it with professionalism. It was as though I had stepped into a space balance between life and something beyond life, a threshold that felt both frightening and sacred at the same time. When you are lying in a hospital bed, stripped of control, you begin to notice the smallest details, the coldness of the sheets, the way your heartbeat sounds inside your own head, the quiet pauses in medical conversations that tell you more than the spoken words ever could. I could feel my body weakening, but it wasn't the fear of sickness that overwhelmed me. It was the overwhelming sense that I was moving towards something I could not stop. It felt like being gently pulled beneath the surface of deep water, not drowning, but drifting. Even the fluorescent lights above me began to blur into a soft, almost otherworldly glow. I wasn't sure if I was conscious or slipping into something else entirely, but in that moment, the physical world felt thin, like a veil I could almost see through. I remember trying to speak, but my voice barely came out. The nurses were adjusting machines and doing their work, yet I felt strangely apart from all of it, as if I were watching from a short distance outside my own body. My breathing slowed, and each inhale felt like it might be the last one I would fully feel. The room dimmed in a way that had nothing to do with the lights. My vision narrowed, and it was as if the air itself carried a heaviness that pressed down on my chest. Yet even in that heaviness, there was a sense of stillness, like the calm in the center of a storm. In that quiet, a deep realization washed over me. I was at the edge of something eternal. It wasn't fear that took hold of me then. It was awareness. A powerful awareness that I was no longer just a patient in a hospital bed. I was standing, in some spiritual sense, between two realities. The boundary between the physical world and the spiritual one had thinned until it felt like I could reach out and touch whatever lay beyond it. The feeling wasn't like drifting into sleep or fading into unconsciousness. It was purposeful, directed, almost like being called into a conversation that had been waiting for the right moment. My heart slowed. The sounds around me faded even more, and I felt an unmistakable shift, like stepping into a silence that wasn't empty but full of presence. As my senses dulled, my awareness sharpened. I could no longer hear the monitors clearly, but I felt someone near me. Not in the physical sense, like a doctor entering the room, but in a deeper, unmistakable way. It was a presence that radiated authority, but also profound peace. It felt familiar, yet overwhelmingly greater than anything I had known. I felt separated from my body, as though I were positioned somewhere just above it, watching the scene but also being prepared for something beyond it. The room seemed to stretch into a space that wasn't the hospital anymore. It was as though heaven and earth had drawn close enough to meet right at my bedside. In that suspended moment, all the pain, fear, and confusion faded. The air felt warm, the atmosphere filled with a sense of gravity. Not the physical pull of the world, but the weight of something holy. My life, with all its memories, regrets, joys, failures, and hopes, felt like it was being held in the palm of a hand larger than time itself. I knew I was not alone. I knew this moment was intentional. It was the beginning of something I had never imagined I would experience while still alive, a moment that would become the turning point for everything that came after. As I drifted into that strange space between consciousness and something far beyond it, the presence that filled the room became unmistakably clear. It was not a hallucination, not a dream shaped by fear or weakness. It was a presence that carried authority so profound that it silenced every anxious thought inside me. There are moments in life when reality becomes sharper than what our senses can normally perceive, and this was one of them. What I felt was not imagined. It was as real as the bed beneath me and as undeniable as my own heartbeat. I sensed Jesus standing near me, not in a physical form I could touch, but in a way that reached deeper than sight or sound. His nearness pressed into my spirit with a precision that removed all doubt. I knew who was with me. The atmosphere around me shifted, as if the hospital room no longer belonged entirely to the earthly world. There was a warmth, a light without color, an intensity of peace that almost hurt because it was so pure compared to everything I had ever known. What struck me most was the seriousness embedded inside that peace. There was no anger, no condemnation, but an unmistakable urgency. It was the kind of solemnity you feel when someone is telling you the truth for your own good, something that cannot be ignored. I felt every part of my spirit leaning toward him, listening not with my ears, but with a deeper part of myself that understood perfectly. Then the message came, not in sentences spoken aloud, but in a communication so clear that it felt carved into my soul. It was as though the words bypassed my mind completely and settled directly into my spirit. The message was simple, yet it carried a weight that shook me. This was a final warning. Not a suggestion, not a reminder, but a last call. The urgency of it hit me like a wave. It felt as though everything I had been doing, everything I thought I could postpone, all the spiritual hesitation and compromise that had accumulated in my life, it all stood exposed in that moment. There was no room for excuses or distractions. Jesus was showing me the truth with a kind of clarity that only comes when eternity steps into the room. The warning wasn't spoken harshly. It wasn't shouted or forced. It was delivered with a compassion so deep that it made my chest tighten. It felt like the kind of warning a parent gives when danger is right in front of you and there's no time left to waste. I understood that this wasn't just about my personal life or my personal faith. It was bigger. It was about what is unfolding in the world, what is moving beneath the surface of everyday life, and how close humanity is to a moment many have dismissed or forgotten. The feeling that the rapture was not something far off, but already set into motion, hit me with stunning clarity. I wasn't being warned about something distant. I was being told that the process had already begun, and the world was more unprepared than it realized. The weight of that truth shook me deeply. I felt a mixture of awe and sorrow, awed by the fact that Jesus would reach into my moment of weakness to speak so directly, and sorrowed by the realization of how many people, including myself, had been living as though there were endless time to get things right. I saw, in a way that felt more like knowing than seeing, the spiritual state of the world. Distracted, numb, caught up in temporary things, unaware of the spiritual clock that was already counting down. The warning felt like a spiritual jolt meant to wake me up completely. As I lay there, suspended between the physical world and the presence before me, I realized that the urgency wasn't meant to instill fear. It was meant to provoke action, transformation, readiness. It was meant to snap me out of the illusion that life would continue indefinitely, as it always had. Jesus wasn't warning me to scare me. He was warning me to prepare me, to redirect me, to shake me free from anything that kept me spiritually. Every part of his message pulsed with meaning. Time is short. The world is shifting, and the spiritual urgency that many have ignored is pressing into reality. It was a final warning, not because he was giving up, but because the window of preparation was narrowing. I felt that truth wrap itself around me, not with terror, but with profound love. A love determined to save, to reach, to awaken. It was a love willing to interrupt my life, even at my weakest moment, to deliver a message that would change everything about how I lived when my eyes opened again. In the days and weeks after that encounter, the weight of the message stayed with me, and I began to see the world around me through a completely different lens. It was as though my spiritual senses had been sharpened, and events that once seemed unrelated or insignificant now appeared to form a pattern. I didn't have to search for signs. They seemed to reveal themselves. The feeling that the rapture was already set into motion wasn't an abstract idea anymore. It was a reality unfolding in real time. What I had previously brushed off as ordinary chaos or normal cycles of history now felt like unmistakable indicators that something deeper was happening beneath the surface of everyday life. One of the first things that struck me was the rapid moral and spiritual decline that seemed to spread across society like wildfire. It wasn't simply that people were struggling or making mistakes. It was the alarming normalization of darkness. Values that once held communities together were being pushed aside, mocked, or twisted. The line between right and wrong, once firm, had become blurry, even celebrated in its distortion. It felt as though the world wasn't just drifting away from God, it was sprinting. The intensity of division, anger, pride, and spiritual numbness in society felt unnatural, as though something unseen was accelerating it. I began to recognize it as one of the signs Jesus had referred to, a sign that humanity was slipping into the very conditions described in Scripture for the moments leading up to the rapture. At the same time, global events seemed to escalate with an almost synchronized urgency. Conflicts erupted in ways that felt less political and more prophetic. Natural disasters grew in frequency and intensity, as if creation itself was groaning. Economic instability, once predictable in its cycles, took on an unnerving volatility. Technology advanced so rapidly that it surpassed moral safeguards, opening doors to control, deception, and manipulation on a scale previous generations could not have imagined. None of these things alone were new, but the combination, the timing, the speed, the alignment, gave me the chilling realization that what Jesus warned me about was already unfolding before our eyes. It wasn't the beginning of signs, it was the culmination. I began noticing another sign, the widespread spiritual indifference that blanketed people like a heavy fog. Conversations about faith that once stirred curiosity now met with apathy or hostility. People were too distracted by the busyness of life, too consumed by fear or pleasure, too overwhelmed to recognize the spiritual urgency pressing in on them. It felt as though hearts were hardening, not through a single dramatic moment, but through 1,000 small compromises. This spiritual dullness wasn't ordinary fatigue. It felt orchestrated, as if something wanted people asleep at the very moment they most needed to be awake. It reminded me of the message I received. How Jesus stressed that time was shorter than we understood and how unprepared many were. Even within the church, the signs were visible. Many communities of faith felt divided or weakened, caught between cultural pressure and spiritual complacency. The boldness that once defined believers seemed replaced with caution, silence, or distraction. Teachings that once focused on repentance, holiness, and readiness were replaced by messages that avoided discomfort. There was a spiritual famine not of information, but of conviction. And yet, amid this, there were pockets of believers waking up, feeling the same urgency I felt, sensing the same stirring, gathering in prayer with a new kind of desperation. That contrast between awakening and apathy was another sign. A separating, a dividing line becoming clearer as the world moved toward its next prophetic chapter. Everywhere I looked, there was confirmation. The spiritual atmosphere felt charged, like the air before a storm. People felt restless, anxious, aware that something in the world had shifted even if they couldn't explain it. The acceleration of events, both good and bad, created the sense that time was being compressed. What once took decades now happened in months. What used to unfold slowly now erupted suddenly. These weren't random coincidences. They aligned with the warning Jesus gave me in the hospital that the rapture was already in motion, not as a distant event, but as a process quietly unfolding behind the veil of the physical world. The more I observed, the more I understood that Jesus hadn't given me a symbolic warning or a vague spiritual nudge. He had shown me the truth. The world was already moving toward an irreversible prophetic moment. Every sign, every shift, every unsettling change pointed to one reality. Time was rushing forward, and humanity was hurtling toward a divine appointment it could no longer postpone. What struck me most after receiving that warning was the realization that it wasn't meant to stay with me alone. It wasn't a private revelation meant to comfort or frighten only my heart. It felt like a message that had been placed into my hands with the expectation that I would pass it along, not out of pride or pressure, but out of responsibility. There was an undeniable sense that what Jesus showed me was something that countless others needed to hear. Believers who had grown weary or distracted, people who had slipped into routine faith without urgency, and even those who weren't sure what they believed at all. The message wasn't about me being chosen. It was about me being awakened so that I could help awaken others. I began to notice how many people around me were living in a state of spiritual half-awareness. Good-hearted, well-intentioned, familiar with faith, yet not truly engaged with the reality of what was unfolding. Many believed in God but lived as if they had endless tomorrows to get serious about their spiritual lives. Others had once been passionate but had slowly drifted, weighed down by disappointments, responsibilities, or the relentless distractions of daily life. Even more were simply tired, emotionally, mentally, spiritually drained by a world constantly demanding their attention. I recognized that same exhaustion in myself, and it made the warning feel all the more urgent. Jesus wasn't calling out at anyone's failures. He was asking people to wake up before the moment to do so passed them by. The warning also had a message for people who felt unsure, confused, or distant from anything spiritual. There are many who have questions they're afraid to ask, wounds they hide, or doubts they feel ashamed to admit. They stand on the edges of belief, wanting to understand but overwhelmed by the noise of the world. There was a new clarity in my thoughts, like a fog had lifted. The spiritual truths I had known for years but allowed to grow dusty suddenly felt alive. I found myself longing to pray, not out of obligation, but because I needed that connection, like I needed air. The conversations I used to rush through with God became slow, honest, and intimate. It wasn't religion anymore. It was relationship. I could feel my heart softening, my defenses lowering, my excuses dissolving. I wanted to be aligned with what mattered eternally, not what demanded attention temporarily. My relationships also began to change. I started recognizing how much time I had wasted being distant, distracted, or emotionally unavailable. I saw how many moments I had allowed to pass without expressing love, forgiveness, or gratitude. The warning made me realize that every relationship is fragile, every conversation is valuable, and every person has a soul that matters more than any argument, misunderstanding, or hurt feelings. I felt a renewed desire to reconnect, to reconcile where needed, to speak with honesty and compassion. I became more mindful of the way I treated people. Not because I feared judgment, but because I understood the weight of eternity in a new way. I didn't want to leave anything unsaid or undone. There was also a transformation in how I viewed the world. Instead of seeing it through frustration or fear, I saw it through the lens of prophecy and purpose. Events that once made me anxious now made me attentive. Challenges that once overwhelmed me now reminded me to stay spiritually awake. I felt compelled to pay attention to what was happening globally, to the condition of people's hearts, to the subtle signs that matched the message I had received. But instead of feeling terrified, I felt prepared. Not because I had all the answers, but because the encounter had anchored me in the truth that Jesus was with me. guiding me, strengthening me. The warning wasn't meant to paralyze me. It was meant to activate me. Another significant transformation was in the way I used my time. I became more intentional, choosing activities that nourished my spirit and pushed me toward growth. I let go of habits that drained me or distracted me from my purpose. I found myself wanting to read scripture more, wanting to listen for God's voice throughout the day, wanting to use my gifts in ways that mattered. Even mundane tasks took on new meaning because I began doing them with a sense of mission rather than routine. Time no longer felt like something I could casually spend. It felt like something I was accountable for. Courage also began to rise in me. Before, I often hesitated to speak about deep spiritual things out of fear of being misunderstood or judged. But after the encounter, that hesitation faded. When you believe you've been given a final warning, you realize silence can be more dangerous than speaking up. I didn't want to frighten people, but I felt compelled to be honest, to share the truth in love. The fear of people's reactions was replaced by the fear of missing God's purpose for me. I knew I had been spared not just to live, but to speak, to encourage, to warn, and to help guide others with compassion and humility. And the final transformation was the deep sense of peace that settled into my life. Not a passive peace that ignores reality, but an active peace that carries strength. The world didn't grow less chaotic, but I grew more grounded. The future didn't become predictable, but it became less frightening. The warning Jesus gave me didn't fill me with dread. It filled me with readiness. It made me want to live every day with intention, gratitude, and faith. It made me realize that transformation isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming aligned, aware, and awake to the purpose God has for me, while there is still time to fulfill it. When I think about everything that happened, what I saw, what I felt, what I heard, one truth rises above everything else. The warning I received was not meant to leave people in fear, but to remind them that hope is still available and the door of grace is still open. The urgency of the moment didn't come from a place of anger or condemnation. It flowed from love, a love so deep that it breaks through the noise of life to call us back before it's too late. There was no sense of abandonment in the message, no indication that humanity had gone beyond God's reach. Instead, it felt like a final invitation, extended with tenderness yet wrapped in unmistakable seriousness. Time is short, but hope is present, alive, and within reach for anyone willing to take hold of it. As that reality settled into me, I realized how many people live with quiet fear. Fear of judgment, fear of not being good enough, fear of being too far gone. But the presence I felt in that hospital room didn't carry condemnation. It carried compassion. It wasn't about pointing out faults. It was about pulling us back into truth. Jesus wasn't warning me because he was ready to shut the door. He was warning me because the door is still open, but not for much longer. And that distinction changed everything. It reminded me that no matter how chaotic the world becomes, no matter how much darkness increases, God's desire has always been to save, to redeem, to restore. The warnings in Scripture weren't written to terrify. They were written to prepare people so they wouldn't be caught off guard. What became clear to me was that the invitation is universal. It extends to the believer who has grown weary or lukewarm, the one who still loves God but has been buried under distraction, disappointment, or routine. It reaches out to the person who has drifted far from faith, who feels unworthy or too damaged to return. It calls to the one who has never known God, who stands at the edge of belief with questions and uncertainty. The message I received wasn't exclusive. It was inclusive. It didn't push people away. It pulled them close. It wasn't about drawing lines to divide. It was about drawing people back to safety while there is still time to respond. As I shared my experience with others, I saw how deeply people needed to hear this truth. Many had been feeling the weight of the world pressing down on them, sensing something shifting, but unable to understand it. They had been wrestling with anxiety, confusion, or a sense of spiritual emptiness. When I spoke about the urgency and the hope intertwined in the warning, it resonated. It touched a place inside them that had been waiting for clarity. I realized that many people were not rejecting God. They were simply lost in the noise, overwhelmed, or unsure how to return. The message served as a gentle reminder that it is not too late, that there's still time to turn around, wake up, reconnect, and prepare. The idea of preparation itself transformed in my mind. It wasn't about fear-driven rituals or trying to earn God's approval. Preparation became something deeply relational, reorienting the heart, finding peace in God's presence, letting go of distractions that numb the soul, and living with intention rather than drifting aimlessly. It became about seeking truth with sincerity, loving others more deeply, forgiving more quickly, speaking with more honesty, and living with a sense of purpose instead of complacency. Preparation wasn't about perfection. It was about openness. It was about allowing God to shape the heart in a world that tries to harden it. I also sensed that part of the final appeal was a call to courage. Not loud, forceful courage, but steady, anchored courage. The courage to stand firm when the world shakes, to hold on to truth when lies surround us, to live with integrity even when compromise seems easier. Courage to choose faith over fear, hope over despair, and readiness over distraction. The warning wasn't meant to paralyze people, but to strengthen them, to help them rise into the purpose they were created for before the moment passes. As the weight of the message settled into my life, one thing became clear. The time for passive faith is over. The time for delayed decisions is over. But the time for hope, redemption, renewal, and transformation is still right here, within reach. Jesus' warning wasn't a final door closing. It was a final door opening, wide enough for anyone who chooses to step through. It was a reminder that while the world rushes toward a prophetic moment, God's heart is still reaching out, urging people to come, to return, to awaken, and to be ready for what comes next with confidence rather than fear.